Nowadays, it seems like just about every anime is an isekai. You know the type, some needy gonk from our world gets zapped over to a fantasy world, and then he does some awesome adventure stuff and gets all the pussy. The genre has become such a bad joke that Katakura publishers went so far as to ban any alternate world story submissions back in 2017. And while the genre is as definitive of 2010s anime as mecha is to 1980s anime, it rather begs the question, where did it all begin? Well, one possible answer is El Hazard, the Magnificent World, which is interesting because it actually predates this current isekai trend by about 2 decades. How does it fare when stacked up against its grandchildren? Well, first let's ask, what is El Hazard? El Hazard, the Magnificent World is a 7-episode OVA series released from 1995 to 1996. It chronicles the adventures of 3 students and a teacher at Shinonome High School who get transported to the fantastic world of El Hazard by a mysterious woman named Ifrita. Once there, each of the Earthlings discover that they possess a unique power in this world, each of which creates a paradigm shift in the current war between the Kingdom of Rashtaria and the Bugram Empire. Can our heroes survive this war and get back home? And why does the ancient demon god of El Hazard look suspiciously like Ifrita? How does the world of El Hazard work? El Hazard is a world heavily inspired by the Arabian Nights, with names like El Hazard and Ifrita bearing more than a passing resemblance to Al-Hazred and Ifrita. These trappings are mostly cosmetic though. While the aesthetic and some stray names are lifted from popular Orientalist works, the culture and society more closely resembles that of the standard anime fantasy setting. I'm not sure if this would step on any cultural toes, but given how the Arabian Nights aesthetic itself was largely the product of non-Arabic imagination, I think the best way of describing the world of El Hazard is as the fantastic trappings of the Arabian Nights, with the Orientalist colonial aspect removed from the equation, which I personally quite appreciate. There are 3 main countries in El Hazard important to the story: Rashtaria, the Bugram, and the Phantom Tribe. Rashtaria is the good kingdom, with its crown princess, Rune Venus, being a benevolent if unsure ruler, and the court filled with wise and supportive advisors, if also possessing a fair share of easily manipulated lords. By the story's start, Rashtaria is pretty firmly losing the ongoing war, with its younger princess Fatora having mysteriously disappeared, presumably captured by the Bugram. As such, many lords are pressuring Rune into unsealing the Eye of God, an ancient superweapon of untold power, which Rashtaria guards from all other kingdoms. The Bugram are a race of sentient bugs, led by the mysteriously sexy Queen Diva. How does she look like that? Well, I suggest you just stop asking these sorts of questions. The Bugram Empire is very definitively the bad kingdom, with its inhabitants being pretty uniform and lacking much personality or intelligence. The thing is, by the story's start, they don't actually seem to be that invested in the whole conquering the world business, despite that being the whole MO of bad kingdoms. Their motivation seemingly just being, well, it's summon a dough, isn't it? The Phantom Tribe is a seemingly neutral kingdom, but in fact they have their own nefarious schemes and goals in this war. Despite being more human-like in appearance than the Bugram, their only distinguishing feature being blue skin, the members of the Phantom Tribe are pariahs across all El Hazard, with no one trusting them thanks to their innate ability to create illusions. Alongside these 3 kingdoms, there are also the 3 priestesses of Mount Muldoon, who are the first security measure in the unsealing of the Eye of God. Each of them controls an elemental power, and they become steadfast allies to the heroes in their journey. Alright, now you got all that? Good, because to get across what our hero's entrance into El Hazard does to this tidy setup, I want you to picture a carefully arranged billiard table with someone breaking the rack, flipping the table over, smashing said table with a hammer, and then setting the whole thing on fire. The 4 schmucks plucked from Shinonome High School are easily the greatest strength of El Hazard, and represent an interesting departure from isekai formula despite predating that formula by a good many years. Your typical cliché isekai protagonist tends to be someone who, upon entering the other world, is suddenly the most important person there, getting all the fame, talent, and girlfriends that they so rightfully deserve. What's interesting about our El Hazard Earthlings, though, is that each of their powers reflect some important aspect of their personality, with the limitations of these powers representing their own limitations or foibles. Our main protagonist, Makoto Mizuhara, may seem like a typical isekai protagonist. given that he's an ordinary Japanese high school student. But instead of someone wishing to be recognized, Makoto would prefer to keep his head down. He's quite academically and physically gifted, but also quite humble and self-effacing, only making a fuss when pressured by some moral imperative. At first, his power seems to be one of simple resemblance. Just like a sapphic usurpadora, no really actually, Makoto is a dead ringer for the disappeared Princess Futora, and must pretend to be her to keep up an appearance of strength for Ashtaria. Since this mostly involves nodding and keeping quiet during important state meetings, Makoto seems pretty suited for the task. However, when Makoto's actual power reveals itself, it's on a level no one imagined, least of all Makoto. Unlocking his power and potential as a person requires Makoto to learn how to stand up for himself and what he believes in. Much more closely resembling a standard isekai protagonist is Katsuhiko Jinai. Coming second to Makoto in everything, whether it be grades, sports, art, or even getting the last sandwich at lunchtime, Jinai wants nothing more than a chance to prove his superiority over Makoto once and for all. However, when his powers on El Hazard reveals itself as the ability to communicate with the Bugram, he instantly uses this to start conquering all of El Hazard. The Bugram were dumb brutes before Jinai came along, not possessing any strategy or even the ability to lie. But Jinai, in his desperation to prove himself, turns them into an unstoppable army, with little care for the human cost of his personal vendetta. In this, El Hazard presents the resentment at the world all too common in many an isekai protagonist, as the sign not of a sympathetic hero, but of a dangerous and unhinged individual. Most unusual of all the Earthlings is Masamichi Fujisawa, a teacher and adult! My god. His powers and their relation to his personality are mostly comedic. Fujisawa is granted superhuman strength, speed, and agility, but these powers only work when he is sober, which is something of a problem as he happens to be a functioning alcoholic and chain smoker. However, he is also someone who takes his job as a teacher very seriously, constantly making sure his students don't get into trouble, and being the last person who still believes Jinai can be redeemed. And lastly, the most intriguing of the Earthlings is Nanami Jinai, the younger sister of Katsuhiko. Nanami is an ambitious young woman, with dreams of entrepreneurship and glory similar to those of her brother. However, while Jinai approaches his ambition from a position of entitlement, Nanami approaches them with an acute awareness of the obstacles she will face with this ambition as a woman. Regarded as somewhat unladylike for her tendency to speak plainly and bluntly, Nanami knows she has to pick and choose her battles against casual sexism if she wants to get ahead, though she struggles to control her temper frequently. Her power to see through phantom tribe illusions reflects her usual awareness of things and turns her bluntness into an asset. Several times in the series, Nanami saves the lives of her friends by blurting out whatever she sees, not realizing that she is seeing through an illusion. At the same time though, Nanami has no combat abilities, and similar to her position on Earth, she has to rely just as much on outside aid, people's mercy, and sheer luck to get anywhere. Also, as pointed out by several other characters, while Nanami frequently sees through other people's bullshit or phantom tribe illusions, ironically enough, she isn't always honest with herself or her feelings for Makoto. This leads to one of the more fascinating aspects of El Hazard, at least for me. See, being an anime fan means having to put up with a certain amount of sexism in the media we consume. Admittedly, casual sexism is something of a problem everywhere, especially in fantasy, but even so, it's something of a pain when a work presents its female characters as two-dimensional or only important insofar as to how they relate to the menfolk in the story. What makes El Hazard so fascinating to me, then, is that it possesses many of the common tropes you see in such works, like a sex pest in the main cast, a trail of girls pining after our hero, and women who see their goal in life as getting married and having babies. And yet, I find myself not as bothered by this as when I normally run into these tropes. Upon pondering the issue, I think a lot of it has to do with the little details used to justify these tropes in El Hazard. These details are subtle, and yet they make all the difference. With regards to Aliel, the sex pest supporting protagonist, a lot of detail is put into making her powerless. This is important because while many people assume criticism of sexual harassment comes from a desire to curb sexuality, the problem I and many others have with it is that it's an abuse of power. The sexual harassment is a problem because it involves someone with power over you abusing that power, knowing that you can't do anything about it, being powerless yourself. This abuse of power is shown in a negative light with Nanami, and so one might think that Aliel's sexual pestering is different only in the sense that Aliel is a lesbian, and thus the show is tacitly condoning sapphic sexual harassment. I think the truth is a bit more complicated, though, for several reasons. Firstly, Aliel is a slave girl in the service of Fatora, whose job it is to satisfy the princess's libido. Even if she herself is also naturally lascivious, she's still in the bottom rung of the social order, and even when she pursues other women, she refers to them with forms of high address. Also, she's significantly smaller and weaker than the rest of the cast, possessing no combat abilities and running and hiding whenever there's a battle. In the end, it all produces the effect of her sexual pestering being akin to a bothersome cat, whom everyone is annoyed by but who isn't actually dangerous to anyone. Similarly, while Makoto does get 3 women with feelings for him by the end of the story, they each have their own reasons for falling for him, and their feelings also help illustrate Makoto's defining self-deprecation. Makoto is, after all, someone who tries to keep his head down and doesn't believe he's anything special even when he excels at things. More than that, though, Makoto is openly okay with Nanami's ambitious attitude, never criticizing her for being unladylike or uncouth, showing a support that Nanami simply does not get from her family or teachers. It makes sense then that Nanami would enjoy the support and have feelings for Makoto. Shayla, the Molden priestess who develops feelings for Makoto, is also a very brash, outspoken woman, who hasn't had much experience or interaction with men before meeting him. And while we don't get direct confirmation of this, it isn't hard to assume that most men are intimidated by Shayla. But not Makoto. Once again, he's very sensitive and supportive of her, and honestly, I find this big, brash warrior woman getting flustered because she doesn't know how to talk about things other than fighting kind of cute. As for Ifurita, well, that would be getting into spoilers, but I gotta say, if someone did for me what Makoto does for Ifurita, I'd probably have feelings for them too. Lastly, while there is a woman in El Hazard who is constantly fretting about being 30 but unmarried, the Muldoon priestess Ms. Mishtal, she's the only woman in El Hazard with this motivation. Shayla is simply confused by the feeling she develops for Makoto, and the other Muldoon priestess Afuraman has no interest whatsoever in marriage or even romance. There's a whole plethora of different female characters in El Hazard with a plethora of different characterizations and motivations. And it gives enough variety that Ms. Mishtal's attempts at nabbing Fujisawa are presented not as the rule but the exception. That being said, even with all these justifying details, that still means El Hazard is a story with a sex pest in the main cast, a trail of girls pining after our hero, and women who see their goal in life as getting married and having babies. Also, there's a bad guy who, just so that you know he's a bad guy, is messing with a kid off camera, so fair warning on that. It's because of all this that I could never uncritically enjoy El Hazard, though I did come pretty close. And if these tropes are enough for you to pass up the show entirely, well, I can't really blame you for that. What does El Hazard have to say? Not much, honestly. I suppose you could potentially see the Eye of God as an allegory for nuclear weapons, but that's a bit of a stretch, and even then the show wouldn't be saying much about nukes. El Hazard is a simple show, and yet it's deceptively simple. Even if it doesn't have much in the way of deeper messages or themes, it has beautiful animation, lovingly crafted characters, and a sense of fun that permeates every aspect of it. I couldn't tell you why I love El Hazard the way I do, and yet I do. I really do love the show. Final verdict. To say El Hazard the Magnificent World is my guilty pleasure would be somewhat inaccurate. That would imply that I feel guilty for liking it, when I don't. I guess a better way to put it then is that I like it more than I probably should. It's my problematic fave! Like I said, there are some tropes that I couldn't simply overlook, and these are enough to bump the show down to a 9 out of 10 for me. And yet, it's such a wonderful experience to watch this series. I really and truly love it, and I think while some shows like Record of Lotus War demonstrate how poorly certain media can age, El Hazard shows how well something can age, especially when the market is glutted with pale imitators. So for now, I'm Marco King, signing off, and I hope you liked this video. If you did, and you'd like to see me make more, please leave a like or comment down below, share my video via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or other means, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you all, and I will see you in the next one.